And ArtsCore became a national model, and a lot of people around the country and probably around the world were inspired by it. But another thing about Lisa is that she really strives to be better, and she doesn't pretend she's made all the right moves. She looks at her mistakes. She's always trying to be real with you, with herself, with the world. I honestly can't remember a time I've seen her do something just to fit in or to try to be some person that everyone expects her to be. She really lets you see the reality, and she's not embarrassed to open to all realms and philosophies and ways of life, which is why it's a good fit for her to be on Beyond Dichotomies, because she's really explored a lot of science, but also spirituality, self-actualization, politics, all these things which we might feel are dissonant. Lisa has been open to all of them, and her journey really bridges them through this idea of coherence, which we do talk about a lot here in this conversation, especially when it comes to our internal world and the external world, and how to overcome this seeming distinction between internal and external, and how that actually gets us into a state of flow or coherence, this experience that we've all had in different ways at times. Lisa really looks at her own life and her intentions, her actions, her thoughts, to understand what the philosophy is that's guiding her, where it came from, how it could be improved. She thinks very seriously about these things, so yes, beware, this is a bit of an intense conversation. We just kind of let it go where it wants to go, and it's a personal exploration, this episode. So I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so glad to introduce you to Lisa, if you don't know her already. All right, let's go. Hey, Lisa. Good to see you. Thanks for coming on the show.
I'm so happy to be here.
So this podcast is about love and philosophy. And as you know, philosophy means love of knowledge. So to start, I want to ask you about those two words. When you think about the beginnings of your journey, what comes to mind when you think of love or an early experience of love?
So, I think one of the things I'm working with that's really interesting to me, my learning edge at 55, which is how old I am on this day that we find each other, is that for most of the time, ever since I can remember, I feel like I was captivated by what was outside of me and the fabulous multiplicity of things in the outside world. I loved learning about becoming connected to the outer world. And in many ways, I got lost exploring and falling in love with what's outside of me. That's kind of what we do as
Mm-hmm.
humans.
Do you remember that from an early age, already sort of thinking of a difference between the inner you and the outside world in a way? Because a lot of kids are just immersed in it.
I was outside and also I was yoked to it because of the relationship with my mother,
Mm.
who was trying her best to keep things afloat for us as a single mom and a single kid. And her demands and needs were primary. And I became the masculine pole in that dynamic. It required me to be very outwardly focused on her. And I was aware at a young age that my survival depended on being focused on what was outside of me.
So it was just you and your mom. You're in Baltimore then? Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I grew up in Baltimore I was born in 1967 in the middle of it. Um, my father was a reporter for the Washington Star and was involved in some of the riots that were going on at the time.
Oh.
He was almost killed by a sniper. He was trying to investigate. It was a pretty tumultuous moment in our history, US history, and all around the world. 1969. He was out trying to interview people about what was going on. The king had been shot, the war in Vietnam, things were just exploding. I think it was right after Robert Kennedy was shot that, anyway, he was out and about going to interview somebody and he was pulled in to a house because somebody said, "You got to get in here." And he was in a primarily Black neighborhood and pointed upwards, and there was a sniper up on the top
Oh,
of her.
man.
Yeah,
That also contributes to being aware of the outside.
exactly. It was dangerous. So then my dad left when I was two. And we were in survival mode for many, many years at that point. So outside focus predominated.
Did you know you were in survival mode? Did your mom tell you? I mean, of course you probably felt it, but
Oh,
was it,
yeah.
yeah.
Oh, I felt it. She had a lot of anxiety and it was pretty threadbare financially. And I knew because utilities might get cut off or things like that. I was working when I was pretty young, starting when I was about, I think I might have been like 12. I was working in a restaurant making food, extra cash.
So you already felt like you had to take control of certain external things.
Definitely. It was clear that I was a required partner in the whole equation with her. And I don't remember feeling much that I had the space or the liberty to be truly in my childhood, that was just a privilege or a luxury in a way. Not to say I didn't have fun and I wasn't a kid and ran wild at certain times and have great memories of all that, but I can feel that I was mostly focused on my sense of my responsibility to her, to our survival, to my own maybe getting out of there alive in a way.
Just to think about knowledge a little bit, did you feel like you needed to learn something or you needed to use your skills, or how did you see this way of getting control or getting some power?
So when you're focused on survival, then you're thinking about being resourceful and you're watching the outside world to understand and pick up all the cues. And I could see that if I was able to get do well in school and secure access to a secure job of some kind, and if I could be within a structure that I could climb, an
Mm.
institution I could climb, that would be a pathway to security. And so I got pretty focused on that. And anything you focus on, you do learn to love in a way. So I did fall in love with the quest for outer stability and outer significance. I
Mm.
definitely fell in love with that, as I think most of us do. I feel like that's part of the developmental process. Although for me, I really did lose touch with an innate curiosity about an internal landscape that ultimately I didn't feel like I had the luxury to mess around in and cultivate.
Do you think that was a waste of time or something, or was it more
Yeah.
you were afraid to go there? Was your mom more in that space, or what was your?
Oh, my mom even found that space threatening because it reminded her too much of the all that was going on in the 60s with the inner development and the new age movement and what she might describe as navel gazing, that I think I had an instinct for, but that I very quickly learned was stigmatized in my family.
Do you remember when you learned that, like an example of it?
I think I was picking it up in the ether pretty fast.
Because that
I
was the
rem-
time of when everyone was experimenting or
yeah,
expanding consciousness and so on.
yeah, yeah. So anything that smelled of that reminded her of my father
I see.
and what happened to him and how he got lost in it, how he got lost in that sort of ethereal place, experimenting with drugs and
Oh, that
so
had to do with why your dad left or what happened with that
very,
dissolution
very
of that
much,
relationship.
very much. Yeah, he was experimenting with LSD, and the early stuff was really strong.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty sure it kind of cracked him
Yeah.
and led to sort of instability and some borderline schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
It made perfect sense that there was this perfect storm of subtle and not so subtle cues surrounding me all the time, which is, find stability and stay far away from the inner landscape that probably yields nothing and in fact could be dangerous.
That's pretty powerful that your father or that this relationship between your mom and dad sort of was centered around this inner exploration having gone in a bad way, in a sense.
Yeah. And I remember many years later, even, we were I was in my 30s and I brought up something related to astrology with my mother, and I thought she was going to lose it. We were driving, and she actually, as we were driving, was so angered by my mention of something that related to something she deemed as threatening.
Mm-hmm.
She opened up the door and got out of the car in traffic
Oh,
to
wow.
get out of the car. So that signaled to me a earlier memory of how threatening it was to her. And so in my childhood, I'm sure I was doing a lot to dampen any of my curiosity about the metaphysical and anything that couldn't be measured.
And how did that manifest? You were already working and things like this, but it was also a matter of getting good grades or what you ended up studying, or what did that trajectory look like
Yeah,
as it
that's
unfolded?
an interesting trajectory, actually, because my mom, because she was really needing, our lives were not stable and needed to find somewhere where I could go that would be more stable, ended up doing the work to get me to get into private school, and I got a scholarship that paid for it the whole way through. So
Wow.
it was a gift. Baltimore at the time, the schools were pretty in disarray, a lot of teacher strikes. So I ended up in this place that was stable, amazing teachers. It was an all girls school, became family, became anchoring. I succeeded in that. I did quite well academically, and I ended up getting into a really good college. I went to Duke and thought I was going to go pre med. And I could feel my instinct of wanting to help. They're wanting to have stability and structure in my life and be that masculine pole for my mom. And there was also this kind of caretaking feminine in me. And I felt it as an urge to serve. And medicine, I was good in math and science. I thought medicine could be the way. So I get to Duke. I go in as pre med. I sign up for all those ridiculous Weeder classes. And in my very first semester, I end up working my tail off in a chemistry class and end up failing, getting an F. And I thought to myself, wow, this is not the way to go. I'll do something else. And 3 or 4 months later, the university sends me a note saying we got my grades switched, and I'd gotten a B instead of an F, but I'd already switched to political science. It was like the universe intervened and sent me
Yeah.
off another trajectory. And political science became what I became really interested in it. And it turns out I was also really good at it. So I was interested in how governments function and how politics operates within an environment. It's the place where we're trying to exert control over chaos, and how and what we look to in society to solve a lot of our problems in this more, what I just call, authoritarian way. It's how government operates. It's about controlling. It's about putting the side rails on what otherwise could be a bumpy, chaotic place in our worlds. So I gravitated to that, no doubt influenced by what I had been trying to do all my life, which was govern a chaotic environment.
That is an intersection of these worlds in a way that wouldn't, for example, freak out your mother or like look new agey or spiritual. But of course, in politics, there's this idealistic streak too, with this wanting to, find a better world. And a lot of the things that people are trying to find when they do something like explore their consciousness and the kind of ways that would have scared your mom. But you still found this way to touch them, didn't you? I guess by studying that.
Very much. And and I also recognize now that I felt a lot of powerlessness as a child. And by going into politics, I was already aware of how quickly you could feel your own power. But it's not personal power, of course. It's more power by rank, power by position. And I looked out at that landscape and started to be successful in it and could see, wow, this would be satisfying. This would be a way, this is a proxy for the power that I wasn't feeling in my personal world, in my insides. Because I was still missing the relationship with an inner reality. It just hadn't been cultivated. I would call it a kind of neglect in a way.
It was probably there, but you just hadn't turned your attention to it, or you hadn't taken time to actually look at it.
I hadn't taken time to really pay attention to it. And so in my dreams, in fact, for years and years and years, I dreamt the same dream over and over again. I'm rushing to catch a plane or a train or a boat to get somewhere, usually home. And home was a variety of cities that I felt in alignment with. And I was always missing it or late, forgetting my bags. So I could never get home.
Oh, it
And
feels
it kind of
emotional.
haunted me. Yeah, it was a haunting dream. And I would wake up, and I just can't tell you how many times I had it over years and years and years and I haven't been having it lately at all. So that parallels, I think, to me, it's a signal of that I was home really does represent some place inside me that is known, explored, familiar. And there was something where I was focused too much on and exclusively with where I was going in the outside world.
When you're talking, I'm thinking about a young woman who's sort of controlling things, taking care, but also knows that her mom has certain parameters that she doesn't want crossed in terms of emotions and looking inside. But also, your dad also had left you, and that must have been something you also couldn't really look at and deal with in that kind of a context, or I don't know. I mean, that
Uh,
also seems to be something hard about exploring that landscape.
Completely. Well, that one was about, I understood only later because I didn't have memory. He left it too.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess he was the apple of my eye, I hear from my mother.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I was in love with my father. I mean, in a way that probably all little girls are.
Yeah, it's the first
Um,
love usually,
it's the
no
first
matter
love.
what. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And when he left and literally disappeared and became emotionally unavailable to me, it was my first broken heart. And that one was, I'm sure at the time, was excruciating. I've felt into that one through other heartbreaks in my life. I've returned
Mm-hmm.
to it, but it's also shaped a kind of a walling off or a redirect of my energy because the heart had felt so raw.
Mm-hmm.
And moving forward, what else would you do except sort of wall it off
To
to
protect yourself, you
risk?
probably had to.
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
interesting to think about this as the beginning of your knowledge of love or your also love of knowledge, right? It's going both ways. But so from your father, you have probably this immersive feeling of love that you don't
Mm.
access through reason. And then with your mom, it's almost the opposite. The way you're showing your love is through reason, or that's what you kind of had to learn. I don't know. I
It's a
wonder what your mom would think about that, though. How do you think she felt she showed her love for you? Was it through worrying about you or through making sure you didn't go off this cliff that she saw your father go off of?
I think my mom saw her expression of love for me as modeling her own decision and determination to make it on her own as an artist in the 70s and 80s. I think she knew on some level that her choice to not get remarried and to pursue a career as a photographer in a sector where there were no female photographers, really, except for Mary Ellen Mark was one of the early mavericks in that world. And she made a choice to not move back to New Orleans, where she was from, after my dad left, because she didn't want me to grow up as a debutante woman. So she was making choices, I think, very specifically to not have me become a sort of an objectified consort. She really wanted me to experience something else. And so that was one way she expressed her love. And for that, I'm actually very grateful. I think she also didn't get in my business at all when it came to my schoolwork or my ambition. She left it completely alone. She had no comment. And all it was is that, wow, great, fabulous, go and do, as
Mm-hmm.
long as it was in this realm that she understood
Mm-hmm.
and she could see that was within the framework of conventional money making.
You framed it as a kind of a ladder, like you were already seeing things as levels or something.
Climbing. Yeah, levels of achievement, levels of access, power, and stability. And when I look back on that, I am really glad that I had that experience. And my son will even say to me now, when I'm worried about his focus or fixation on his own ambition, he'll say regularly, Mom, you were exactly this way. And I say, yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right.
Because when you were
But
his age, he's what, 21 now? And
21.
when you were
Yeah.
his age, where were you exactly? Were you climbing?
Yeah, I was graduated from college. I'd won this big award in for this paper in international law that I'd written about the EU's and the taxes that they applied commonly, especially on luxury goods. And I did this deep economic analysis of this, which is I look back on now, I'm like, wow, well, that's interesting.
Wow.
So I was interested in that. We were hosting forums with EU parliamentarians at the time at college. So I was seeing myself as kind of heading off, hungry for experience, hungry for the world, hungry for that adventure. And I think
Okay.
I was feeling that desire to go out and see what I was made of in the world. Coming out of
Yeah.
college, I could remember feeling like, let's just see what happens now without all these protective handrails that college really was. You're still in the theoretical. I want to go out and I want to apply it. I want to see how all this stuff plays out in the real world.
Did you feel like you were pushing a little bit too at the edges, like you wanted to see what was there that you couldn't already sense?
I think I
What
wanted to
open?
see what I could master,
You were still externally focused.
definitely. What can I push up against? How can I know myself? Thinking of it now, it's the way that I knew to know myself is to be in relation with the outer world. So again, picking up on that theme of love,
Mm-hmm.
the love I had was the love of exploration and learning, but the learning was fixated on primarily on who am I in relation to my outside
Mm-hmm.
world.
You were getting a lot of external input. People were saying, wow, you're doing amazing things. So was that part of it too, that you wanted more of that?
Yeah. I thought if I can do this, what else am I capable of? I remember I worked for a summer for a congressman in college on Capitol Hill, and I was a legislative intern and I supported the legislative correspondence. I wrote letters to constituents. And it was during the time when Oliver North was being questioned by Congress about his involvement with Nicaragua and the all of that kind of messiness with during the Reagan administration. And we were getting a lot of letters about it. And it was right in the middle of that. And they asked, so I started writing constituent letters in response to this situation. And I remember a senior guy who worked for the congressman at the time, this guy Ben Cardin, who's now a senator for Maryland in the US Senate. The AA, they called him its chief of staff, said that I was writing some of the best letters he'd ever read, and I was 20. And how did I know what to say about a complex ethical, political situation on the world stage? How did I know? What was I tuned into? I was tuned into the outer world really intensely. I'm reading people, I'm reading context, I'm reading whatever I can absorb that is describing that reality, whether it's, the work I was doing in school or just reading voraciously The Economist and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Just I was reading all that. And then I was watching people intently and deeply studying human nature. Again, outside of me.
Fascinating. Because I mean, we'll get to it, but now there's a lot of inner observation, but this outer observation was sort of the way that you developed those skills in a sense, it sounds like.
And those skills are, I'm so glad I have those skills. They serve me so well. They serve me so well. And they serve all of us well. I mean, it's a fantastic dive and a kind of level of mastery to be that attuned through all your senses to this outer reality. And you can navigate masterfully in the outer reality until you can't, until it's not enough.
We're going to get to that, but first,
Yeah.
this power of observation, how much of it was something you nurtured and how much of it was how to survive, like that you learned how to observing was your power or how to be powerful?
Well, I mean, there is a lot of data that says that people who grow up in really traumatizing situations, or children of alcoholics often are some of the most masterful politicians, people who do read the tea leaves, because their attunement to what the outside world seems to need is so precise and so subtle, picking up on signaling that other people are missing because you have to.
Sometimes had these moments where you could be a child and play, but in general, you were on guard.
Guard, on guard, like sentry level on guard, like a little bit like my German Shepherd with the ears that point up and are always pointed up because they're always listening. They're never closed off to the world. They're always listening for any sign of a change that might signal danger.
And when you bring that into the gathering of knowledge, you start to realize that that's kind of how you get up that ladder, right? It's how you get the knowledge that puts you a step ahead.
Yeah, because it's not just the knowledge, it's not just what you know, it's what you can project about what you know, how you can find trends, elicit trends from all that information.
I was going to ask you about patterns. Had you started to notice certain patterns? Because to write these briefs, you kind of would have had to, I guess.
I think that pattern making skill is ultimately what sets it apart, because anyone can download knowledge, and obviously, and then there's a whole level of interpretation. But the pattern making, the pattern seeking, there's a kind of an oracle quality to it. You're looking and you're trying to see where all of those things lead to ultimately, and then make some decisions or some choices within that range of possibilities based on tendencies, probabilities, all of which are usually more intuitive, what you might call data slicing, where you're just looking at a whole bunch of data, but ultimately just finding a thread based on your own intuition.
It's almost like predictive processing. Where has the trajectory been, and therefore where is it going to go? It's almost like statistical. But you said something about downloading knowledge. So it makes me think that you think of knowledge as this kind of substance or external thing, not necessarily the power of observation itself. So do you distinguish these things between the sensory observation and pattern recognition and knowledge? I mean, do you think knowledge is something kind of in this external world, or how do you see that?
No, I think you make a good point in that there is that differentiation. I would say that I wasn't very conscious that I was downloading or receiving sensory input that was equally on the same equivalent level in terms of my assessment of its value as everything I was reading, listening to, digesting from the sort of the world of written knowledge or history, and that my own senses, the data I'm getting from my senses, my felt experience, was participating with this as a partner. But I don't think I had the awareness that how powerful those two were working in tandem at the time, because again, I was separated from my understanding of how all that sensory data comes in and becomes interpreted, and a way of navigating the world, what you are looking into, and how it pairs. So it's such an embedded, it's so completely mixed with this other piece. And I just simply wasn't aware of it. I couldn't have articulated it that way. But now that I look back on it, it's clear to me that that's what was actually enhancing all this other kind of knowledge that I was taking in through my cognitive function.
Yeah, it makes sense because you weren't looking at that inner landscape, as you said. You were focused outward, so you weren't looking at your own patterns. But in a way, you were noticing these patterns in the things that you read, the things that you saw, the things you observed. But in a way, those couldn't be disconnected from your own patterns. It's just that you hadn't actually turned that on yourself yet.
Right.
So you graduate from Duke political science and you start exploring?
So I leave school, and the first job I get is in Washington, D.C., with an economic consulting firm. And my college sweetheart and I move into an apartment in Arlington. And I work for these PhD economists who are called in as expert witnesses to the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, and mostly to support mergers and acquisitions, making companies bigger. We were supporting the robber barons, basically. But in 2 years' time, I learned so much again about this kind of deeper level of worlds, the systems of economics and politics and how they play together. And I became the research coordinator, which was a coveted job. I got to manage people. I made a lot more money. It was a kind of equivalent of a lot of people go out of school and they go and work for these financial consulting firms. And it was similar in that way. They work you really hard. You work long hours. So I got savvy on software that was just coming out, savvy on computers that were just becoming available. So interesting to think about it, this era. And then I left that job, and my college sweetheart and I decided to move to Seattle. He had a job offer. We had come out. Seattle was beautiful. I kept thinking, oh my God, why hadn't I seen the West Coast? It was just gorgeous, and fell in love with nature's beauty, and fell in love with my college sweetheart, who I subsequently married too young. It was early spring. The sky was that oyster pink light. Everything was green. It's kind of like how it is right now. So I said, yeah, let's do it. This feels really good. And I needed some time and space away from my hometown, and my mom wanted to get out of Dodge. So that summer, after our jobs wrapped up, we drove across the country.
And you were in your 20s,
Yeah.
mid 20s or something by then, maybe?
24, 25. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what was this love like? Was it also externally
Yeah.
focused?
Yeah, it was. I should have realized it was dangerous as soon as my mom said, oh, gosh, he just so reminds me of your father when he was young. He was wonderful and smart and kind and deeply confused. He was also disconnected from his inner, self. And so got out to Seattle. We both got jobs. I got a job working for an environmental consulting firm. He did too. So we landed on our feet. But within a couple years, he was drinking a lot, and I was getting increasingly freaked out by that. And so he was in his demons, and then I fell into mine. I ended up having an affair with an older man. It was a mess. It was one of those messes. And it was the first time I realized, oh, I'm a mess. I'm not this, I have my, shit together, and I've done all this, I've succeeded, and I can master my universe. I realized that my emotional landscape was messy and untended and pained and inflamed. And it blew up, and our relationship blew up, and we got divorced. And there was a lot of heartache in all of it, a lot of collateral damage.
So you'd climb this ladder, and a lot of people would look at you at that age. You have this incredible job. You've just moved to, you probably didn't know it at the time, but the city that was about to explode in very positive ways, and everything that you were interested in and doing. You're in love. You're kind of at the top by these external standards that you'd been so focused on. But then at the same time, you'd unmoored yourself. I mean, you'd taken yourself out of the external landscape that had become familiar or maybe comfortable and safe. So what cracked you open? Was it that you'd gotten to a place where you felt like you'd arrived and so you had to look elsewhere? Was it that you'd gotten to a new place physically? Like, how do you see all that?
I think when it all blew up, it was 26 or 27. So that's a time where a lot of people run into a particular phase towards entering into some sort of new level of maturity. And I felt like it was a wound that was coming to the surface from my earliest childhood. And What set it off was his instability and my own heartache that needed to be seen finally and dealt with on some level. It's interesting because that time frame, within 4 years' time, I got out of that relationship because we'd gotten married quite early and then gotten out of that relationship, gotten a new job, worked for a city council member. I mean, all the ways I was kind of on the outside, keeping my world together, making it look like I had it together. Got another job working for the mayor at the time. But inside, underneath, it was a hurricane inside me. There was nothing stable. It was like inside, there was a storm going on, and it was throwing stuff up against the wall. And I was really uncomfortable, but I was keeping it together. And I kept on this trajectory of I'm going to stay in jobs. I'm going to keep on the ladder. And then when I was 31, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. So that one finally got my attention. And I was 31, and it was an aggressive tumor. Mm. They were concerned, they being the medical community surrounding me in that moment, and warned me that this was dangerous. So I accepted what they threw at me, which was all the various medicinals. I call it the poison and burn. It's the medieval torture chamber that is chemo and radiation, because it really felt like that. Went through all that. And it changed everything. It broke me open in a way that nothing else. It stopped me and stopped this outer focus, this quest for outer conquest, quest for outer knowing, quest for outer loving. And again, nothing else could get my attention, I guess, except for my own mortality. I didn't take the opportunity to look inside, truly, really asking myself, how did I get here? Until this diagnosis. And it says a lot to me about my own story. Some call it victimology. I don't know if I like that word. My own narrative that had things happening to me all the time.
Well, that makes sense if you saw yourself as an agent in an external world rather than a kind of this inner being.
Yeah. And so I didn't, on the one hand, I saw it was through my own motivation and quest and capacities that I was making things happen in the outside world. But then the flip side of that is that the outside world was happening to me. It was, and I had no real control over it. My father had left. My mother was this. My world was that. I needed to control that to maintain my stability. So yeah, I do think that the turning point, meeting one's mortality, I was that far gone in a way. And I remember the moment. I have very distinct memories. It was a Christmas. By then, I was actually with another partner. So the mess I'm talking about was me being in multiple relationships and mashed up together. I was in this desperate attempt find an outer balm to the pain I was feeling. So the relationship I was in then was that person who came in to hold me at that time, who ended up being the father of my son. It was around Christmas time, and we were having a bunch of people over, and I did not want to go downstairs. I had just found out. I knew that the only way I could be in that group setting that would be palatable to those people coming was to put on the face and the smile and the ease and the hostess and the welcome. But to be lost in my own pain and suffering and to project that to the group wouldn't have worked. It wouldn't have worked with my partner at the time. It would have worked for anybody who was coming. My perception was it wouldn't have worked at all for any. So I had to put everything I was feeling to go inside. And what I felt going inside was the Grim Reaper, this figure carrying a sickle, walking towards me saying, I'd like to have a conversation with you. And I said, I don't have time for that. And I went downstairs. So even then, I was still refusing the call to come in and dialogue with an inner being who was terrified of dying at 31.
Yeah.
So when I think back on, I go, wow, I was so convicted that if I didn't show up for the outer world that I loved so much, that I felt a contractual obligation to be present to all the time, this outer reality, this love of the outside and what it gave me, if I didn't do that, then I would risk everything. And that was 25 years ago now. And I would say the next 25 years of my life, interestingly, 25 years, yeah, we're all about finding my way back to a relationship with the internal.
Hmm.
And it took that long for me to get to know the inside of me because I had neglected it for so long. I was reluctant. It was scary. My heart had broken. I'd walled off the heart. It was this inner chamber that I just didn't get any oxygen. And so it's one of the reasons why, I mean, I love, Andrea, I've always loved talking with you so much, is that you embody, for me, I experience someone who's been able to and had an innate inclination to hold both more seamlessly, the outer world relationship, but also that inner world relationship you held in a way that was really, I could palpable. And I felt that you knew something about it that I didn't know. And interestingly, there's many more people in my life that are younger than me, especially younger women who seem to know more about it than I know. And it gives me great hope and humility and makes me think that, perhaps in this next generation, the outer quest can calm down a little bit, might be less of an addiction, and the inner is calling, and that more of us will. And I don't mean to get off on this philosophical track, but it does feel like the love of some inner knowing is innate in younger generations, potentially. I mean, it is, and yet there's a lot of things still pulling us out.
Yeah. Yeah, there's quite a few things that come up there. Let me try to explore. The first thing I was thinking about was vulnerability, and that you hadn't really had a chance to be vulnerable, and that this was part of why, or this was sort of your role in a way, like excel, hold things together, control. So you'd never really had this space where someone said, okay, just be vulnerable. At least it doesn't sound like it.
Yeah.
And then I was thinking this sickness forced you to be vulnerable. Like, as you were saying, that's really like the last way that you were going to have to confront the fact that you're vulnerable, is that your actual biological life was threatened. And I know what you mean about us seeing different things in each other, but also in you, by the time we met, there was such a deep strength. And I think it probably had always been there, and it had to have been connected to this way that you'd manifested yourself externally. So for me, it becomes very interesting of how these 25 years might have been about being able to have a space where you can be vulnerable, and somehow that also already being the strength that you had that you didn't know. Or does any of that make any sense?
For sure. I know that people's perception of me, I remember my cousin saying to me just a couple years ago that she always perceived me as this impenetrable force growing up as a child. And when I would admit to being vulnerable with her, or that I was scared of something, it didn't compute. It almost as if the world, my outer reality wouldn't really allow me didn't want me to be vulnerable. A lot of people came to depend on me as invulnerable, impenetrable.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking when you were saying about going downstairs, that all those people were looking at you as a invulnerable, strong person in this in this way that I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to get a grasp on of how that must have felt to be seen that way by everyone, to
It
have
was a,
learned to be seen that way by everyone.
and it was a cage.
Yeah, of course.
Um, and I'd made it. I take full responsibility. I'd made it. And it's how I came to know myself. And it's how I came to be in relation with the outside world, is to be that. And it didn't give me very much freedom to be a whole person, because as I crashed and burned and fell apart in various times in my life, which I did, numerous times after that, starting with the breast cancer was the beginning of the crack of, oh, she's human, she's mortal, she's, she bleeds.
Mm-hmm.
That trajectory was difficult because the projection was so strong. Even to this day, I can feel, no matter what I've gone through, there's a kind of expectation that I would be inviolable in a way to things that come at me. And so when I do things that appear to be not having it together, or reveal a kind of a neediness, essential quality of need in my humanity, I experience the world being sort of appalled and impatient.
Do you think there's some way in which, because this was from almost the beginning of your life, that you were in this role, that you, before you really had memory, 2 years old or whatever, that it became how you learned language and how you learned poise and how you learned expression? Because I think it's actually, even the way you communicate with the world is tied up in that pattern of strength and confidence, which, like you were saying, that's a huge power. It's how you've gotten to places people don't get to, in a way. But of course, also, it's very hard to break through that, Yeah.
I feel it now these days in how I hold my body. You said poise.
Yeah.
I think I've always held my body with a kind of rigidity, with the kind of firmness, because I hold that clarity and firmness, the masculine pole. I know, I decide, I take action. And it's great. It helps in a lot of ways. And I remember, I was thinking about this just last night. I was thinking back to a conversation that I had. I was working, fast forward, I'm working for a consulting firm, my own, that I started. And very quickly, the local government and heads of government were calling me in to resolve really difficult, intractable conflicts within their agencies. And I remember being called in to present a report to the head of the transit agency in this region. It was a report that we had written talking about what a mess their engineering department was and the things they needed to do to make it better. And there were 7 of us around the table, and he was sitting at the head of the table, and he was looking at his phone as we were launching into the presentation. And I could see everyone accepting that. And I found it really difficult to concentrate. And I thought, what a waste of time this is. So I stopped. I said, can we pause for a second? I just want to ask, is this what you regularly do during presentations? And if so, I'm finding it hard for me to stay present, because without you being present, I can't be present. And I'm not sure what the value is in our presentation. And when I think back on that, and that's an example of things I've done multiple times in my career, where I just decide to say something that in the moment might feel really hard to a person in high power. But what was true for me is that I couldn't be present. I was finding it intolerable because I couldn't be present in the meeting. So what is that? Well, it's a sense of conviction about what needs to happen in a given moment. But I thought back on what it took for me in my body to hold the conviction that my need was valid. In the midst of that was a rigidity in my body that I didn't know how to do any other way, but to simply get really convicted about clarity. And then suddenly I'm like a frozen statue almost. It would have been really cool if I could have done it in a loose sort of adaptive way, but transit's like a military organization, and I just adapted the military stance of conviction. And it's what I'm dealing with now in my body, is that I'm unwinding from that level of rigidity on a regular basis. And I hear from my Rolfer and the person I do cranial sacral work with that, in fact, most of the senior level executives she works with are so tightly wound, are so rigid in their bodies. She can feel how much pain it is that they're carrying because they don't know how else to be in these senior level positions that have that much responsibility. There's a kind of rigidity there.
Yeah. That speaks to what we were talking about, the difference that's not really a difference between this way external knowledge and the senses and the observation, because you notice how there's not a separation between the way you've learned to be a body, because you aren't in your body, actually you are your body in the world, but we learn to think of it as inside and outside in a way. But so first, as a child, you would have had this bodily reaction to your situations that was already your cognitive self. So it's not like there was an inner you and an outer you. There was you learning how to be that way. So it's in your body and it's in your actions. And only through kind of turning the observation on that body do you start to change it a little bit. But I'm so glad you told that story, because I've seen you do that before. Those situations where you say what you just say it if something's uncomfortable. And usually it's not just you that's making uncomfortable. So it's a bit of a gift that you're giving to the space. But it is a strong physical, bodily way of doing it. Yeah.
One of the things that, though, one of the liabilities associated with that is that then it also draws a lot of projection, and it's drawn projection in my life all over the place. So people who, for whatever, feel that that's an intimidating, someone in their exterior is showing that much kind of conviction about something, or being able to speak with such clarity about something. There's so many other ways to be in the world. And I do think that for people who aren't really settled in themselves, can find that as a threat, basically, to, because there's a way in which people experience that kind of clarity as a kind of violence.
Well, I guess it's a violence of their expectations. And I think this goes to this, you brought up this male female energy thing, even starting when you were a child. And of course, we're now trying to learn how that too is always in all of us. But I think there's those characterizations, right? And expectations of how a person is supposed to behave, and a certain kind of way that things are supposed to come out from a certain kind of situation and person. And some of it is just that when those expectations or those predictions don't play out the way they usually play out, then people get uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah. It's a great lesson in expectations. I feel like that's one of the things I'm regularly encouraging people, my clients, anyone I've been working with, is that how difficult it can become the more expectations we carry around about anything. It's a limitation, and it also tends to create just misinterpretation on a regular basis, as opposed to an open filter that allows for what's happening to be what's happening.
So we need to come back to this moment, this very important moment where you're going downstairs. So you went downstairs and you just you played the role, or what did you do as a party?
I suited up, as they say, to put on a good face and let people know that everything was okay. That I
when was the first moment you were able, or not able? When's the first moment that cracked? Do you remember a moment where that didn't happen?
Yeah, it was finally, so I ended up year later, getting pregnant, having a son, over many people's speculation that I would be infertile after the chemotherapy. And I was not infertile. I proved, again, it was like, I'm going to prove them wrong. I can have a child. And so had this beautiful little boy. And that started to crack me open because, of course, having a child usually does. And I started to get in touch with a vulnerability in myself as a mother, loving someone that much, recognizing that heartbreak would come when they left, or any number of things. It just, you know, heartbreak is coming whenever you have a child. And so it started to awaken me that possibility of that vulnerability in my heart. But then a couple years later, I was pregnant again, and with a second child, and I really didn't want it. And I ended up having a miscarriage at about 4 to 5 months. So it was a little bit dangerous. But that was the beginning of that next level of vulnerability. And what it did is it actually cracked finally the veneer of what I was pretending that of my strength. And I knew that I was going into something dark, the cave, the place, finally going to a place that would really be not in the sun, but in the underworld, so to speak. Because at that point, truly everything fell apart and it pulled me in. I lost my second marriage. I left the organization I started and loved. And I returned to the wound of my father. And this was all happened. We lost my beloved dog. It all happened in a year's period of time. The breakup with my son's father was excruciating and violating. And in the end, I recognized that what felt like a betrayal of the outside world to me was ultimately the betrayal of myself to myself. That Grim Reaper that just wanted to have a conversation when I was 31. Finally, I was having a conversation with, and Grim Reaper, I say that word, it's just like life in another form. Got my attention at 42, 10 years later, and took me fully into her grasp, embrace, and said, we're going to be partners for a while. We're going to go down. And this time we're going to go way under. And it's going to be painful, but you've left it for so long. I tried to get your attention. I had no other choice. It just took me. We went way, way down under the waves for a while. That was 15 years ago. And I feel like in some ways, I'm only just coming up for air. Because one could say that I came up for air from a lot of that emotional pain, and I ended up making another firm, and I went into this consulting business and went back into government and did quite well and grew it and brought on partners and was making a lot of money. But I was clawing my way in the dark there for a long time. And I was in a really dark, hard place. Everything was hard about that work. It wasn't easeful. It wasn't joyful and creative the way that I had found a way to be in the previous years. And so, was it penance? I don't know. I was learning a lot. I learned a lot in these last 15 years of being under the waves, being in a darker, more tumultuous place.
I want to think about this time because you started something called Arts Core.
Yeah.
Was that before you got sick, or was around the same time, or
right around the same time? I got sick. I was still working for the mayor. I worked through all my cancer treatments while I was working for the mayor. Once again, like I would leave my office and go up and get radiated on my lunch break.
Oh my.
Until finally I decided I can't do this anymore. Seattle went through the whole WTO drama in back in 2000.
Hmm.
And I realized it was enough of working 80-hour weeks and going through cancer treatments. So I left and I started dreaming, and I dreamt about making something beautiful again. And I wanted to do something with kids and art. And I don't know why I wanted to do something with kids and art. I know
Hmm.
now it has to do with reclaiming a part of my own childhood and
Hmm.
reclaiming relationship with my mother as an artist. Like somewhere in
Yeah,
there, I
it's
want,
all those same themes in a way to go even deeper and also to work with children who are so raw and sensory and emotional and
and real
Mhm.
and vulnerable and uh, not yet shaped so much by all this molding of the world. And going back to this theme of love, I mean, now that you've started us there and we're still there in a sense, like that journey into politics in my 20s was fueled by love. And when I left politics and pursued arts core as a dream, it was love magnified. It was love again, but coming from a new part of me that wanted to live in a different way.
Before we began, I asked you to send me like some quotes of things that came to mind just around this idea of love. And one of the quotes is by Heidegger, and it's actually longing is the agony of the nearness. Longing is the agony of the nearness of the distant. That's what it is. Yeah. So
Mm.
you just brought us back to love, but there's something with this longing now that comes into my mind too. And also, when you were talking about the grim aspects of it, there's something of longing in there too.
That's what makes love so bittersweet. I'm coming to feel love and longing as being very close cousins. Because if love is what I feel in my body when the corners of my eyes start to well up with a little bit of tears, like I'm feeling right now,
Mm-hmm.
there's longing for something I can't quite touch, but I know exists, that I know is something where someplace we inhabit, some possibility.
Mm, yeah. It's like you want to merge with this, or sometimes I think of love when I love someone so much that it's such a, it is a longing because you can't do anything about it. You just have to sit with it. And that is a feeling of longing in a way because you want to take care of them or express it or hold on to it. There's a million things you want to do when you feel that, but you can't. You just have to sit there with it. And longing is kind of the way into that feeling, maybe more than that. I don't know what it is, but I'm trying to get at what I think you're also talking about.
Yeah. I mean, I have, when I think about what I was loving at that when I left the mayor's office, I I felt a love for a childhood I never had,
Mm-hmm.
um, and a love for a memory of being with my cousins, making plays improvisationally,
Mm-hmm.
a love for um, my mother's own creative endeavors that I watched blossom when I was a childhood as an amazing photographer. Like I loved that part of my life, no matter how chaotic it was. Um, and I had a deep longing to return to touch it again, to feel it again,
Mm-hmm.
know it in my life again somehow,
And to
and
prioritize it.
prioritize it, to prioritize it. The irony is that I created this organization and surrounded myself with creative people. And we did beautiful, beautiful things and made beautiful invitations for young people all over Seattle. But I ended up playing the role again as that masculine pole. I ran the organization, I did the fundraising, I wrote the grants, I managed the details.
You even created spaces that were vulnerable and open and joyful and creative. You created them for other people. And at the same time, you were the responsible one holding up those spaces rather than necessarily being in them. There's a bit of a difference.
There's a big difference because to be in them means that I would have had known how to receive.
Yeah, I think that's what I was thinking of earlier. I wanted to say, Lisa, did you talk to anyone? Did you express any of this? Like, did you enter that space of letting go, being held, letting someone else hold the space? It's the best way I can think of it.
When I left art school, they gave me a party. And I just read all the notes actually that people had written. Um, and they made it about me, which I didn't really want. But they invited all the teaching artists and students and parents and donors. And people made music and offered me and invited me up. One of the teaching artists had me come up on stage and present me with a drum and have me play it with him. He's a professional cellist. And I was terrified, but they were sort of forcing me to receive. And I felt very held then by what was going on around me and very seen and held. It's a bit excruciating. And I think back on it now, it was really, really powerful. And powerful because there are very few times like that I've allowed or put myself in a situation to feel that, to be thing. And I think that's why love, if longing, it's like I had this longing for that, and that world received me in that way. But I'm pretty clear now that the fullest kind of love is happening now for me because I'm receiving myself for the first time. I had to have all these experiences of giving and giving and giving and doing and being clear and firm. But I mean, and there's still not a lot of clarity here for me because it's so new.
Yeah.
To receive myself.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
Yeah. That's really powerful because especially thinking about this way that you're really changing what you think of as internal and external space so that at the same time that you're letting someone else hold the space, which sounds like the hardest thing for you to do, to be held, to let someone hold the space and trust it and fall into it. But at the same time, you seem to be realizing that that's trusting yourself in a way too, or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have to say, I was around during Arts Corps and you changed so many people's lives. I know you don't want to hear all this, but other people should hear it. You really created a community and you gave a lot of people a way to express what they wanted to express. And you affirmed that creativity and art was essential and important and powerful and worthy of attention. And you made teaching artists. People could take themselves seriously as people creating these spaces. But at the same time, I have seen, yeah, you never really quite can sit with that space that you created and let people be grateful to you in a way. There's something very vulnerable about that. I don't know how, what do you think it is? Like, what is that? That doesn't even almost make sense. Like, why should it be so hard to let someone else hold you, hold the space that you're in? Be, it's a gift to them in a way, but there's something about, then you have to,
well, then I
is
have
it an admittance that you need them? Or
it's an admittance of how much my heart aches to know that much love.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's admitting that how broken my heart is.
Yeah. That makes sense. Because if you feel how much, if you feel it fully, then you have to also feel how much you haven't felt it and have wanted it, longed for it, to go back to that word.
And then if I reveal how much I've longed for it, will that be seen as a liability? Will that, I feel like that's the great challenge, I think, for all of us in opening our hearts, is if we reveal to others how deeply we long for connection and love and this place of being held
Mm-hmm.
will we've all experienced that feeling as if it was taken advantage of, feeling as if that was a liability, feeling it as if it cost us something. And that if they see how much you long for it, that they would hurt you, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And that I see us all kind of in a similar place in the sense that heartache is running a lot of the show these days. um, and yet there's something powerful about being able to walk around with a broken heart and it be normal.
Being
And
able to sit with your heart open is, I mean, broken is how it opens. That's where the light gets in, as the quote goes, right through the cracks. So, I mean,
yeah,
I hear you saying what you're trying to do is expand your notion of self a bit so that it's not what we were talking about at the beginning, so strict, this strict
yeah,
inside outside control, not control, this binary dichotomous male female energy. We've been going back and forth between a lot of those, and this, what you're trying to describe, for me echoes how hard it is to live in this paradox where strength is vulnerability and love is longing and male is female and female is male, and it can become so hard to uh we always feel like we need to be one or the other, I guess. And so I think in those moments where if you let yourself be held, if you let someone else hold the space, if you still think of it in binaries, then it's like, okay, then that means I can't hold the space. It doesn't mean that. But if you're thinking in those binaries, it does. And that's how it will affect your life.
yep. And then you get stuck in the polarity.
Yeah. Then you need to prove yourself again. And then you're
Yeah,
just back and forth again.
yeah,
Rather than like, how do we realize that those spaces are not opposites? They're part of the same space. And it has something to do with a different notion of what a self is and what internal and external is and all of this. I think in a lot of your work, you explore that,
definitely. Yeah,
with
because
other people. You help other people explore that.
well, and I do it myself too. And I long for integration. I long for being merging with my own longing
Mm-hmm.
to really understand it as some sort of deeply embedded process
Mm-hmm.
that isn't outside or inside. It's just how the energy is moving through the
Mm.
space.
Yeah, to dance in this way.
Dance with
And
it.
as you said, that also means realizing you're worthy of being loved, even if you aren't in control, even if you are in control, even if you're being held or holding,
Yeah.
this longing, and like this opening to the longing is also opening to like your own belief that you're worthy of also being held, which means being longed for and loved by the world around you.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a hard one too, right? Because when you're longed for by the world, then what will the world want too much of me?
Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
my mother was longing for a relationship with me and it felt like she was trying to consume me.
I think that's a good point to bring that up too, because it's not that
So
you just dissolve your boundaries and give everything. Some of it is protection, right? If you're creating such spaces and giving so much, you need that poise that we talked about earlier of the masculine or whatever, the control, that's also protective of not losing your energy, your
right,
capacity.
right. Having some definition, having some clarity about what's okay to what is in alignment with your system in any given moment. How does your system want to thrive? In what conditions, in what relationships is it thriving the most? Can it be nourished the most? This is a
Yeah.
big dance right now, I think, for me in how I make choices. Is it nourishing to me? Is it not nourishing to me? And it gets back to, am I nourishing myself at the right levels? Is a way of seeing myself as worthy of love, finally, because I care about the fact that I'm making choices about my own nourishment. And I mean that metaphorically, versus being sort of indifferent to that, and having a real discernment about that, on about everything coming in or out, meaning what I'm being in relationship with, is my way finally of noticing that I'm loving myself enough to be discerning,
Mm-hmm.
and to point others, and to prioritize self-nourishment fundamentally.
I'm so glad you said that word disappoint, because I think that's the hard thing, maybe speaking from my own experience or something, that it's what's hard about taking these steps, which you take a lot of being raw and who you really are, is that people might see it the wrong, might misinterpret it, or think that it's weakness when it's not. And I think it can be hard to let that space be, and know that it's strength, even if others are going to be disappointed or characterize it as weakness in the short term. Does that make any sense to you, of this being able to be misperceived, or being able to be seen as ways that you're not, and not try to fight against it?
Definitely.
Yeah, I think that's hard.
I think it's really hard. I mean, here's an example on the fractal level of the smallest to the largest. So the smallest is not using emojis anymore in my texts because it's too time, and I'm realizing I'm doing it because I want to make sure everybody knows that I'm nice. And part of me is like, why do I have to prove that? I'm nice. I'm a good person. Like, I'm just sending a text.
Yeah, yeah,
On the
definitely.
largest level, on the highest level, is the last 3 years, because I made a choice because of my own physical knowing, my deep bodily knowing, everything I'd gone through, that I didn't want to take the vaccine when it came out.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying really hard to explain it to people in a way that they could understand, that it was coming from a deep place in me, that I
Mm-hmm.
just knew
Mm-hmm.
it was probably not going to go well.
Mm-hmm. Because your body's been through a lot of
Been
things
through
that
a
people
lot.
said you should do that you knew you shouldn't, and you did it anyway,
Exactly.
and it
And I
wasn't good.
overrode my body time and time again. And I didn't want to do it this time. But man, that was a tough one for people to not be disappointed by.
I think that's a great example too, because people then assume that you're taking a stance that no one should have a vaccine, which was not at all what you were doing. It was a personal decision based on your own trajectory that no one else could understand.
Right.
And it wasn't you weren't saying vaccines are bad, but that's exactly what I mean, where it just gets you have to stay in that space means that it's inevitable people are going to think that, and you have to know it, and you can't tell them, every single person, that, and
Nope.
fight it, and so on. So it becomes this very long game kind of thing of waiting. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. It really built that in me of like, it's okay. You're going to disappoint. We're going to disappoint people. And, and I was as gracious as I could be in the face of that disappointment. I saw it time and time again. And yet I kept choosing to express love and inclusion back to them about them and their choices,
Yeah.
to say, we can do this, folks. We
Mm-hmm.
can be, you know,
Mm-hmm.
uh, at what seems like polar opposites, without making it that somebody is actually antagonistic to an entire worldview. Yeah. I wonder, and I hope, if that, what I just did over the last 3 years, isn't helping me to step into whatever might need to happen next
Mm-hmm.
in my own world, which is a greater and greater comfort with disappointing, not meeting expectation. Um, you know,
Yeah, I think it goes what you were saying about clarity of looking, now that you've turned these observational skills that we talked about at the beginning, that you use to excel, and you've built many communities, and you've gotten awards, and you've been praised for this in the external world. We didn't even talk about Creative Ground yet, that another organization that you created that's also helping people. Um, yeah, but turning this on yourself is a different sort of thing. And to get clarity about that, as you were saying, and to know, okay, I know why I'm doing this. I've thought through it. It's the best thing I can think of at this moment. Doesn't mean I won't change my mind later, but in this moment, this is where I am. I'm just going to be here. There's a kind of clarity that then you can handle other people misperceiving, being disappointed, and so on. But you can if you're only in the external focused. You have to really turn that observation on yourself and be okay. Know that you're doing it with the right intention, right? If you're going to be at peace.
Exactly. And that sort of leads to where I've ended up in terms of work. And again, what am I doing? How is all this interplay with the relationship between inner and myself and the outer world coming into what's the dance now? So just what you said, about this idea of having conviction for yourself, regardless of what the outer world might perceive. So in this moment, I know why I've sort of been on this trajectory with such an intentionality to really, well, what am I clear about in myself? What is home for me? What does that inner reality look like? What are my anchoring principles around the environment that I love and I care for and I tend and that it's most important to me in me? Um, is the project that I'm involved in, or the projects that I'm involved in now, is related to working with teams and team leaders inside of institutions to figure out how they're going to be within a collapsing structure, institutional structures, in such a way that it might create some beacon of stability in amidst the collapsing and the chaos of within these structures. And I love this quest because it reminds me a lot of what is happening, what we know about, and I know this is a metaphor that's used often and probably overused, but I am experiencing going back into institutions again. I've been in and out. I've gone into them and I've come out. I've gone into them, come out. Whenever I come out, I get a break, I rest, I rethink things, and now I'm going back in. And within there, I can see that there is a level of chaos happening because deep hierarchies are so ill equipped to solve and resolve the problems of our time. They don't enable the kind of collective intelligence, empowered collective intelligence we need to access to really be making interconnected solutions in every sector. So if institutions are collapsing in this way, there are teams of people who try to come together. In every institution, there's teams at all levels who are trying to come together and be cohesive, around the work that is theirs to do within that organization. But most of the time, those teams are not cohesive. They're struggling with power dynamics. They're not sharing information transparently. They don't trust each other. And they're getting pressure above to act in certain ways, and they're getting pressure from below. And everyone's in a sort of pain and disorder in a way. I'm seeing this in nonprofit and private and government sectors. But my curiosity, my longing in this moment is the knowing, feeling the distance of the possibility of a small group of people finding coherence with each other, finding a kind of trust and seamless connection where they really start listening in new ways and sharing information in new ways and building their shared purpose, simplifying it in certain ways, and designing their ecology as a team in a new way. I felt what that feels like. It's amazing. And I love and long for the experience of more of that with other teams. And because I can sense that when that starts to happen, it's a new template of stability within the muck, within the collapsing goo of, back to the metaphor of a caterpillar dying, goo, institutional goo, before it becomes something new, before it can be aligned with other imaginal cells and create the butterfly. But I know, just coming back finally full circle, I couldn't have done this unless I had discovered my own coherence, which has to do with the integration of my longing, myself, my inner and my outer, all of those pieces. If I want to help a group, a team, a group of 7 people find coherence with each other,
Mm.
I better have coherence inside me as much as I possibly can in order to do that. Otherwise, I will just attract more incoherence.
I
And
love
so,
this word coherence. This dance, this walking the edge of the razor blade, this not one, not two, not inside, not outside dance that is not one person in a team. It's many people. It's dynamic. It's not that one person's going to be the same always in that constellation for the coherence to hold.
exactly.
Yeah, it's a different way of thinking about self that speaks to this way we were trying to talk about holding the space, paradox, longing, and love, where you're clear about who you are in that moment. And you're also okay if in the next moment it's going to change. But there's a coherence, there's a continuity.
Mm-hmm.
And it is this awareness and clarity, really, is what it is, this observation, sensory dance as part of something larger and not a static part of that, a part that's exchanging itself with that.
Exactly. In the same way that we might do if we were out on a ship in the middle of the ocean, looking up at this changing set of stars and constellation around us. Where are we going? And finding our way in that with each other on this
Mm-hmm.
small island of floating material amidst this larger constellation of forces. How can we find coherence in all of that? There's the tension of doing it in your small ice, unit that's
Mm-hmm.
floating on the ocean, the team that's in the midst of this larger contextual reality, and then everything that's around you, but something is guiding you, and you can tap into that as a team collectively and be aware of it and sometimes lose sight of it, but ultimately the work is kind of staying in connection to it and being open to the fact that it is changing, that you're where you're going will change. You're in dynamic conditions,
Mm-hmm.
and
It's a movement that you're
the movement.
participating in and co-creating.
Yeah, it's a movement. And it's very countercultural at this moment. People want plans, objectives, decks, PowerPoint, decks,
Yeah. Yeah.
solid
Bullet points,
bullet points.
rules.
You know?
Yeah. This really brings us back to the beginning, I think, because it really shows how your own journey in this way that we've described is actually the knowledge that you now have to bring into this environment where we need a different way of understanding what coherence is, not as something static and binary, but something alive and co created and dynamic and about longing and love in the way that you express. Can you see your own evolution since the beginning and how that now is inextricable from this work that you're doing?
Yeah, I realized there was no other way to get here than the way I took. There were other ways. For this one, this path, I look back and I go, wow, so I'm so glad I made all those detours. I took those other really dangerous side paths that led off that cliff over there. I climbed back up. I found that other way. Here I am in with a kind of wholeness I never thought I would have found.
Mm.
Sort of always imagined, maybe that's one of my longings, that I would live with a missing pieces inside me.
Now you feel like you can be on this moving landscape and know that it's not about arriving but it's about, what is it about? Like,
Well, it's certainly not about controlling. I know
okay,
that much.
no.
I've definitely resolved my fixation for the most part with control, not in the sense of our immediate things and, making sure that I can find some warm socks when I need them, but, more
Yeah.
just about um, I have relinquished this idea that I can control my relationships. And I thought I could, I think, for a long time.
How do you see your poise now? How do you see your body in the poise and what's
Mm.
changed or what do you want to feel from that embodied place now?
I really hope to experience more agility and fluidity in my physical body on a day-to-day basis. That would be a beautiful unfolding from where I've been. It's been a lot of years holding that rigidity. And so I'm dancing spontaneously and moving spontaneously and being in water whenever I can and trying
I was thinking of flow. Yeah.
flow. But it also has to do with how I hold conviction. So if I want to be convicted and clear and solid within what I know, how can I do that physically in a different way and still feel moored to my own place of being? And I don't know yet. That's the next level of learning for me, is how to be with this physicality, this material that isn't as immovable as the energetic or the intellectual, the cognitive, all these other things that can float and move more dynamically. But the physical is more rigid. And yet what do we have to learn about how the physical even becomes more agile over time?
And how this spatiality, this coherence is related to that. That when you're changing your own poise, you're, of course, changing the parameters of the coherence of
Yeah.
yourself with the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And finding more coherence inside of me, because if I find a new poise that is more in alignment with the true dynamic energy that's always in there, moving and surrendering, and that's actually happening inside of us, inside of our bodies. So much of what happens inside of us is unconscious, actually. We don't have
Yeah,
control.
most of it.
Most of it, I mean, all but like this little bit is we're conscious of. So what would it look like to really reflect that level of humility of what is moving dynamically and self-organizing intelligence? It's already there.
To actually be present to it, but not need to control it. That's
And how can that, if we're doing that inside of ourselves, then what does it look like when we're doing that? I mean, doing that within our own bodies, then what does it look like when we're doing that in relation to other bodies?
or maybe doing that in relation to other bodies becomes doing it within yourself. Maybe those boundaries are the thing that are not so real in that situation
Yeah.
of dynamism.
Yeah. You make a really good point. And if there's one thing I'm really going to take away from this, because you've emphasized it several different times, is the interplay between the two and their essential tensions going back and forth in a way that they're abstractions, but they are pointing to something around what's out there that you're learning from, and how do you integrate it, and what's happening inside you is applying outside. And if those things start to become more indistinguishable,
That's a flow. That's
that's the
this
flow.
liquid dynamic state that you describe.
That's the flow.
Yeah.
And I truly hadn't been able to put words on flow that way, because it was more, I was just going with my intuitive feel of it until just now, as you kind of emphasize that point.
Well,
So
your
that's,
description of coherence, when you look at it in that way,
yeah,
becomes very powerful, I think, when you think of it as a coherent, continuous movement that we make into these binaries of inner and outer, so as to learn how to observe them in the way that you've said you needed to in your life. But then there must be another place from which you can view those as coherent.
right.
Yeah. So I think, to end it, I just wonder, if you look out at the landscape, the inner and the external, like, just what's your sensory feeling as you kind of go into this day and the rest of this year and this place that you're in, with work, with self, with relationships? What's your vision?
I look out, it's almost, here's in my experience, I've I've crawled out onto this little hillock, and I was sort of down in a valley for a long time, struggling along, and I didn't have much of a view. And I'm just cresting, and I'm looking up over this lip of land, And I realize as I cross over that lip of land and I look out, then I'm in a completely different geome. And it's hard to take in. Right now, I can't really tell you what I'm seeing. I just know that it's unfamiliar.
Is it bright or is it colorful or is it?
Definitely bright and colorful. It's sort of magnificent. It's slightly daunting. There's big craggy mountains, there's rushing rivers, there's intensity. It's dynamic. It's probably more dynamic than where I've been in this valley for the last several years. And yet God, I want to go. I'm not sure where I want to go first. But I know I'm ready to go out in it again. And I'm excited. I'm a little nervous. I'm very nervous, to be honest. I don't know what it implies about how it's going to change my life. I've been here before, and I recognize when I've been here before, everything changes. Certain things, certain relationships stay the same. Very few. I hold on to very, the through line. You and I are one of those.
Oh, yeah.
But almost everything else changes. And this has happened so many times. And so I'm at that point of feelings a little grief for what might fall away.
Yeah.
Excitement, because that valley is going to fall, a bunch of what was in that valley is going to fall away, but some excitement for what's coming. And some slight trepidation that my 55-year-old body is not what it was, but I'm getting stronger. And so I'm prepared and recognizing that maybe what this asks of me this time is a different level of being and an offering that has more to do with wisdom and not so much with fixing.
Yeah. Well, that love and knowledge just persists. And it's all tied up with all those endeavors.
So love keeps coming, gluing us back together.
You can't get away from it.
Nope.
Yeah. Well, Lisa, I just want to thank you for all the paths you've opened for other people and for me. I just want to send you some gratitude.
Well, I want to send you huge gratitude because with you in your presence, I can feel our shared kindness, the kind of kindness that is the through line in relationships always.
Yeah, it's love.
It's love. It's love.
And I could talk to you forever, but I think this has been powerful. So I think we should.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, let the silence come and think about it a little. And yeah. All right.
All right. I love
All
you.
right. Oh,
Soon.
hi.
Hey,
Glad to see you.
yeah.
That's a nice goodbye.
Okay.
All
I'll
right.
talk.
Be well.
Bye.
Bye.